The affirmative rebuttal is 15 minutes. The negative rebuttal is 15 minutes.
I lost track. I guess I'm the affirmative, right? There's plenty of things to rebut here, and of course I'm not going to spend another hour answering each one of Dr. Gish's points. I can't do that. I'm more than welcome, however, usually after these debates, if anybody wants to talk to me, we can do it immediately after the debate, assuming that you're not tired and completely sick and tired of the whole thing. Or you can email me. My email is my last name, which is difficult to pronounce, but you can find it on the program, at UTK, that's University of Tennessee, Knoxville, .edu, that's for education. So if you want to ask other questions you don't get to ask tonight, please feel free to do that. In the next few days, weeks, months, I'm going to be around, hopefully. Okay, so points to answer. Dr. Gish said that there is no theory of origin that can be scientific because nobody was there. Well, that's a misconstruction of science. Science is not about being there. There are some experimental sciences, like biochemistry, for example, in which Dr. Gish was trained, that are about being there. I mean, biochemistry, if you do an experiment, you have to be able to reproduce a result right now or in any other place in the world, in any laboratory in the world. But it doesn't always work that way. According to Dr. Gish's definition of science, astronomy is not a science because it's an historical discipline. Well, I bet that a lot of astronomers would get really upset about that. You can do science in an historical sense. There is no problem. You don't have to be there. The way it works is pretty much the way a policeman or an investigator finds out about the scene of a crime. You don't have to be there watching the crime to find out who the culprit is. If that were the case, our criminal system would be in big trouble. Instead, there is a science named criminology that actually studies pretty much how you reconstruct events in a logical and consistent way that brings you to the answer. Now, in historical sciences, as in sciences in general, however, the answers are provisional, as I said before. There is no problem there. It's just the best that we can do. Yeah, we would like to know for sure, but we don't. I haven't heard any better alternative because Dr. Gish wasn't there either, so he didn't see what was happening. It's just that the scientific explanation of what happened makes a lot more sense than the explanation Dr. Gish gave. By the way, Dr. Gish actually did not give a single explanation of absolutely anything in the last hour. Have you noticed that the only thing that he's done has to try to poke holes in the theory of evolution, which is perfectly fine, but he has not proposed any alternative theory. That's why creation science is not a science and evolution is. Evolution is a science, therefore it is fair to attack it where it doesn't go well, where it doesn't explain things, and we'll try to find out why it doesn't explain things. But I haven't heard a single thing on the other side. That's not fair. That's not a scientific debate. That's a debate about science versus non-science. It's a use of a double standard. Dr. Gish also mentioned that I am an atheist. I don't know why that has anything to do with the thing that we're debating here tonight. I didn't know this was a debate on the origin, on the existence of God. I don't think that's the point of this kind of debate. As Dr. Gish pointed out himself, there's plenty of evolutionary biologists who are theists. So the fact that one person is or is not, it doesn't really have anything to do with the debate at hand tonight. And I would like you to think about that for a second. Dr. Gish also said that evolution, he had a problem with my saying that evolution, teaching, and democracy, the argument that we don't teach in a democratic way. Well, we don't do a lot of other things in a democratic way. In front of the law, there is democracy, but in every other field of human inquiry and endeavor, there isn't. If you have a problem with your car, unless you're good with the car, what do? You go to the mechanic. And you trust that the mechanic is the expert and he does a good job. If he doesn't do a good job, then you go to somebody else or you sue him. But normally, that's what you do. If you have to have an operation, a brain surgery operation, you go to the surgeon and you don't say, well, I'm going to question exactly where you should cut and where you should not cut. You just trust the expert. Why do you trust the expert? It's not a matter of trusting authority. It's a matter that that person has spent several years, in some cases decades of his life, studying that stuff. So when Dr. Gish says, with a background in training in biochemistry, he tells us that Lucy really did not walk upright, that the Australopithecus was really not an ancestor to human beings, because he knows better. I find that difficult to believe. What he's doing there is questioning, in fact, he's flatly denying the conclusion of hundreds of scientists who have been working for decades to find out exactly those things. Now, I don't believe things just because somebody tells me, but I have respect for people whose main job is to do that particular thing. These are experts on primates. So, if I'm not an expert on primates, and I'm not, I work on plants, well, I tend to follow what the expert on primates tell me, which, by the way, brings me to this thing. I don't think there is any serious evolutionary biologist who actually thinks that, that apes descended from man. I don't know who Dr. Gish was referring to at the Emory University Primate Center, but it just happened by chance, because I didn't know he was going to say this, to have a book here called Good Natured on the societies among chimpanzees, which is written by Frans de Waal. Frans de Waal is at the Primate Center at Emory University, and I can guarantee you that he never would say anything of the sort. Dr. Gish has quoted several scientists. Now, the problem with quotations, of course, is that they usually are out of context. You have to read the whole thing before you actually understand what that person was saying. It's pretty easy to pick up a couple of quotes and put them out of context and say, see, Professor Gould didn't know what he was talking about, or Isaac Asimov didn't know what he was talking about. Well, I didn't know which particular quote Dr. Gish was getting tonight for this debate, but I did find a few interesting ones in this published stuff. One of them is in Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No, which he published in 1995. And that's a quote from Stephen Gould, the character that was right off the screen at one point in my presentation. The quote from Gould, according to Dr. Gish, is, "The fossil record with its abrupt transitions offers no support for gradual change." Period. Well, I went back and checked the quote from Gould. In Natural History, volume 86, page 22, published in 1977, this is what Gould actually said. "The fossil record with its abrupt transitions offers no support for gradual change, comma, and the principle of natural selection does not require it. Selection can operate rapidly." As you can see that if you listen to the whole thing, it has exactly the opposite meaning that Dr. Gish gave it. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that you have to stop quoting people somewhere. But you have to be careful. Somebody, it has to be in context, or you have to take the time to explain the context, because it's pretty easy to make people sound like fools when they're actually not. Dr. Gish said that evolution is atheistic and pretends to explain the origin of the universe. Well, that's news to me. Evolution is a theist-neutral theory. That is, it doesn't make any statement about the existence or non-existence of God. There is no such a thing. When I teach my evolution class, I don't say, and by the way, you have to start by assuming that there is no God. The assumption is that we can explain processes by natural forces. But that doesn't say anything about the existence or non-existence of God. Furthermore, evolution doesn't have, and let me clear this thing for once and for all, evolution does not have anything to say about the origin of the universe, or for that matter, about the origin of Earth. That's astronomy, that's cosmology, that's change, that's not evolution. Evolutionary theory, as is intended by Darwin and by the so-called neo-Darwinians today, to which, as Dr. Gish said, I belong, deals with once life started, how did things change on Earth? And that's what I'm here to debate tonight. If you want to debate on the origin of the universe, you better call Stephen Hawking or some other cosmologist who will tell you much better than I can how the origin of the universe actually occurred. I know a few things about it, but I'm not qualified to discuss that, and it doesn't have anything to do with evolution. It's a different thing. It's a different question, okay? It is a very valid question. It's a very interesting question, but it is a different one. There is nothing in Darwin or in no evolutionary biologists have ever written about the origin of the universe. Dr. Gish keeps referring to mutations as errors. Mutations are not errors. If you call them an error, that's assuming that there is a design, there is a plan, and somebody's made a mistake. Mutations are differences, they're changes. Something goes in a different way in the DNA molecule, and therefore that causes a particular consequence. That consequence can be a positive or a negative one. If it is a negative one, then you can conclude that that was an error, and it's going to be selected out by natural selection. But if it was a positive, how can you possibly call an error something that causes a positive effect? And as I said, I invited already Dr. Gish to come to my lab and see plentiful of mutations that actually cause positive effects, that is, they increase fitness. Soren Lovetroop quotation, 1987, that's the scientist that proposed the so-called theory of the hopeful monsters. Well, I find very funny that Dr. Gish actually picks up on that example. First of all, the actual hopeful monster theory was not proposed by Soren Lovetroop in 87, but by Richard Goldschmidt in 1940. And it has been a serious contender for evolutionary theory for some time. People have taken it seriously because Goldschmidt was a serious geneticist. They've done the experiments, they have proven it wrong, and now that's it. It's taught in the history of biology textbooks, not as a modern theory of evolution. It just doesn't stand up to hypothesis testing. What Dr. Gish is referring to over and over, the fact that scientists make mistakes. Let's take the example of the Piltdown Man, for example. It was a hoax. Yes, but who found out that it was a hoax and why? It was not a creationist, I guarantee you. No creationist went there and said, no, this is a hoax and here's why. Who found out were other evolutionary biologists, because other fossil remains of humans that were found in the meantime just did not fit with Piltdown Man. There was something wrong with Piltdown Man. Every other fossil fell exactly in the position that is predicted by evolutionary theory, but not Piltdown Man. So somebody finally went out and said, what the heck is this Piltdown Man? And it turned out it was a hoax. So evolutionists found out because that piece of evidence did not fit with evolutionary theory. It would have falsified evolutionary theory if true. It turns out it was not true. How much time? 2 minutes, thank you. There are no examples of observed creations of new species or speciation events. Yes, there are. I'm flabbergasted that that's the claim. There's plenty of examples in the literature. What kind of examples do you want? Do you want invertebrates? Yes, we have observed fruit flies and other insects forming new species under our very eyes in the last 50 years. There are several plant species, new plant species have been observed, and there are several, even a couple of vertebrate species. There's a couple of seagull species that have occurred, that have originated in the last 50 years or so. So what do you mean there's no evidence of the origin of new species? Of course, it's a rare event. Remember that evolution occurs over millions of years. So it doesn't happen every day that you observe these kind of things. The fact that human life is too short, it's not fault of the evolutionary biologists. But again, evolution is also an historical discipline. There are no intermediate fossils of living organisms, of living kinds. I showed you several. There are several intermediate fossils that originated modern whales, modern giraffes. There is the transition between reptiles and mammals. There's tons of living examples of plants which are intermediate from different species. There's tons of examples of invertebrates living today which are intermediate. People cannot tell whether does this belong to species A or species B. There are tons of hybrids that are formed between species and intermediate forms that are difficult to tell apart. So how can there not be any intermediates? Trilobites, they are perfect because they have hundreds of double lenses to see underwater. Yeah, but what about all of those other invertebrates, the overwhelming majority of which don't have the double lenses and don't have such perfect eyes? How does Dr. Gish explain that? Well, the evolution explanation is that it took several hundred millions of years for the trilobites to get there, and therefore you observe a bunch of other things that have not gone there, that are intermediates. Dr. Gish also quoted Douglas Futuima, a leading evolutionary biologist, in 1986, saying that there are no intermediate forms of animals previously to the Cambrian period, or the so-called Cambrian explosion, when a lot of modern animals came about. Well, that was 1986. The quote is out of date. In 1998, Futuima published a new edition of the same book, in which there are plenty of Precambrian fossils that are discussed, several of which are the ancestors or are forms similar to the ones that have been seen after the Cambrian. How did vertebrates come from invertebrates? That's a great question. We don't really know much about that. We know that the most similar invertebrates, the closest ancestor to the vertebrates among invertebrates are sea urchins and starfishes and things of that sort. Well, but people are working on it. It's not that the evolutionary biologists are necessarily idle. A woman named Billy Swala at Vanderbilt University has published a couple of years ago a brilliant paper in Science, one of the leading scientific magazines, showing actually how you can turn an invertebrate into a chordate, which is the actual ancestor of vertebrates. Thank you.
Well, I had to put the cassette or whatever it is here in my pocket. I hope it's working all right. I believe it sounds all right. Now, he said that I offered no support for creation. Ladies and gentlemen, the fossil record that I described is precisely what the creationists would expect and predict. That is absolutely positive evidence for creation. The fact that I described about the evidence for design and purpose, that is positive evidence for creation. That is what we would expect. It's what we would predict. The nature of scientific laws, the second law of thermodynamics, is exactly what a creationist would expect. The evolutionist says things are going this way. The creationist says, no, God created, and we would not expect things to become more complex, more highly ordered, going up some evolutionary scale. But if something did happen since creation, it could only cause things to go downward. And that's what we find. Things are deteriorating. The entire universe is wearing out, perfectly in accord with the predictions of the creationists. And the probability relationships, if you try to calculate the probability that amino acids will arrange themselves in a precise order to make a protein molecule just by floating around in the water, first of all, they never combine one with another. Absolutely not. I'm a biochemist, a protein chemist. I know that that doesn't happen spontaneously. You have to make it happen. You can do it in the laboratory, but it never happened in the ocean. And they'd never line themselves up in the precise way to make a protein. They had to be lined up just as Sir Fred Hoyle said. They had to be created by an intelligent creator. That is positive evidence for creation. We offered very much positive evidence for creation. Now, I want to name even one scientist who said that apes came from people. I'll name that scientist, Jeffrey Bourne. Dr. Jeffrey Bourne. His name is spelled B-O-U-R-N-E. He was director of the Primate Research Center at Emory University when I saw an article in a magazine in which he was quoted as saying that apes came from people. So we wrote to him. We asked him, did you really believe this? He says, yes, I do. And I said the same thing. I've read other articles in the scientific literature. Apparently, some things have missed. Dr. Pigliucci, he said I quoted Gould and I quoted him out of context. Now, I have quoted Gould extensively in my literature, in my books. My latest book is Evolution of Fossils Still Say No. And I don't quote out of context. Now, what he did say, there's no evidence in the fossil record for gradual change. That's the fact. That's the fact I was describing. Now, his explanation of why that is true is a different matter, but that's what he said. If he didn't believe it, why did he say it? Now, Dr. Pigliucci says mutations are not errors. Well, may I ask Dr. Pigliucci then why we have this incredibly complex system in our cells, in our bodies, and in the bacterium to repair mutation? Do you know when a mutation occurs? When the wrong nucleotide is put into a DNA molecule, there's a mechanism that edits the DNA as it is reproduced. It edits this DNA, and as it sees the wrong nucleotide, that's a mutation. That's an error. It cuts it out and replaces it with the correct nucleotide. Now, it's not always perfect. It doesn't always work. So some of these things slip through. If there were not errors, then why is our bodies and why are cells trying to correct these non-errors? Yes, they are errors because what? They're just random. They just happen, not because they are needed or anything like that. And these errors are supposed to change a little microscopic organism into human beings. Now, he mentioned biogeography. He showed a picture of marsupials on one side and placental animals on the other. The marsupials are found in Australia. Nobody knows why all those marsupials went there. but evolutionists and creationists agree that they migrated there. They certainly did not evolve there. No evidence for that. But the significant thing is, you see, evolutionists believe that things evolve by chance, by these random accidental mutations. He said that, let me just bring another point on that. Here's another quotation from Douglas Fatuma, Evolutionary Biology. What he says this. He says this, by coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life processes superfluous. The point is this, what is Dr. Fatuma saying? That you have this blind, uncaring process of natural selection coupled, he said, by coupling undirected, purposeless variation, that is these mutations, blind, to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection. That's how we got here. Evolution is a random process. There's no question about it. What natural selection actually does, ladies and gentlemen, natural selection does work. But what it does is preserve the species. It eliminates the oddballs, those things out on the fringe. It preserves the species. The most fit organism, in any case, is the average individual. That's what natural selection does. He says there are examples of transitional forms. He mentioned the mammal-like reptiles. Well, let's see what Tom Kemp says about mammal-like reptiles. He published a book, Mammal-like Reptiles and the Origin of Mammals, in 1982. On page 3 of that book, he says, of course, there are many gaps in the synapsid fossil record. Synapsids are these mammal-like reptiles. There are many gaps in the synapsid fossil record with intermediate forms between the various known group almost invariably unknown. Page 3. Page 327. The apparent rate of morphological change in the main lineages of the mammal-like reptiles varies. The sudden appearance of the higher taxa, families, and even orders immediately after a mass extinction, with all the features more or less developed, implies a very rapid evolution. And a quote, you see what he's saying? You have an extinction, suddenly there's these new forms already, all the features already formed. They didn't evolve. How could they evolve? He says gaps at the lower taxonomic level, species and genera, are practically universal in the fossil record of the mammal-like reptiles. The gaps are almost universal, he said, the mammal-like reptile. No, they don't offer evidence for evolution whatsoever. And he mentioned Cambrian. Ladies and gentlemen, in those Cambrian rocks, we find clams and snails and trilobites and things like that. Now, I said, nowhere on the earth have they ever found fossilized ancestors to those creatures, and that's true. They have found some other fossils they believe are older than the Cambrian, but they are not ancestral. They cannot be ancestral to those Cambrian animals. Absolutely. The Cambrian animals, those things that I showed on the screen, all appear fully formed. There's no question about that. Absolutely. There's no transitional form. He's trying to say that I'm presenting old material. I follow the evolutionary literature very carefully. Our institute subscribes to 50 different scientific journals, and we buy all the latest books on evolution. We study those very carefully. And I'll tell you right now, I know that nobody's ever found evolutionary ancestors to those Cambrian animals. And he admitted we have no transitional forms between the invertebrates and the fishes. Ladies and gentlemen, that fact alone destroys evolution. That cannot be true, and evolution be true as well. Now, he mentioned the Grand Canyon. Do you know that the geologists who are familiar with the Grand Canyon, the geology of the Grand Canyon, no longer believe the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon? I'll tell you why. What they believe is this: that plateau, where the Grand Canyon is, was uplifted 65 million years ago. The north rim is about 8,500 feet. The south rim is about 7,500 feet. So that was uplifted, they say, 65 million years ago. Now, according to their ideas and their dating systems, they say the beginning of the Colorado River was only 4 million years ago. So if what they believe, and I don't agree with this, but if they believe that that this thing was uplifted 65 million years ago, and the Colorado River came along 60 million years ago, would it climb up over that and go down and cut a canyon? No, it run right around it. They have no theory on how the Grand Canyon formed. They don't know how the Grand Canyon formed. We do have certainly some very good ideas how the Grand Canyon may have formed. Well, he says creation denies all of science. Oh no, we believe in creation because of science, the facts of science, the fossil record, the second law of thermodynamics. Dr. Pigliucci says that the origin of the universe and the origin of this solar system has nothing to do with evolution. Oh, I'll tell you one thing, you pick up a high school biology book and you'll find theories on the origin of life. There'll be a chapter devoted to the origin of life, and almost all of them will have some idea, something to say about the origin of the universe. Oh yes, it does. How can you have evolution unless you have an earth? And how can you have an earth unless you have a universe? You see, it's all tied in together. He doesn't want to talk about the origin of the universe. No, he doesn't want to talk about that. He doesn't want to talk about the origin of life because he knows that it has absolutely no answers scientifically. He says, why so many creation stories? Well, people dream about these things and so forth and so on. We believe, personally, I believe the record of creation is found in the Bible. Now, we are not discussing the Bible or anybody's theology. I agree with Dr. Pigliucci. We're not here to discuss anybody's theology. But I certainly have to say my position is based upon a theistic supernatural creation. Why are so many creation stories? Well, anybody can dream and create stories, but we believe nothing compares to the record of creation found in the Bible. Now, he says about Piltdown Man that it was the evolutionist who discovered the Piltdown Man, the fraud. Do you know who discovered it? It was a chemist. That's who it was, a chemist. They analyzed the bones for the incorporation of certain chemicals that's found in the soil. And it's incorporated into the bones as they stand in the bones. They found that the jawbone had none of this in it at all. The skull had a little bit of it. But they could not be fossils. They could not be old at all, because they hadn't been sitting in the ground at all. Now that was discovered by a chemist. He measured the amount of fluoride in those bones. As they stand in the soil, they absorb fluoride from the soil. The jawbone had no fluoride in it at all. Couldn't be a fossil, couldn't even be any older than 1912 when it was found. And the skull had some fluoride, but it certainly was not 500,000 years old, as the evolutionists claim. It was the chemist who it wasn't the paleontologist, or it wasn't the anthropologist who discovered this, it was the chemist. And anybody should have been able to discover that fraud if they looked at those fossils in a careful way at all. They would have discovered the fraud. But it fit their ideas, they liked it, and they didn't look at it very carefully. Now he says new species are occurring, and he has examples. I wished he would contact Dr. McGulis and let her know about this, because she would like to know. Certainly, she's going around and telling false stories. If he knows of species that have evolved or have formed as a result of accumulation of mutations, the scientists say it has not happened. It's easy to say that it has happened, but it has not happened. And he says he knows a lot of good mutations. Well, I wished he'd put that in the scientific literature. Because when I asked an evolution, would you please describe what you think is a beneficial mutation? They talk about sickle cell anemia. An individual who inherits this sickle cell gene from one parent, he's not quite healthy. He's not quite as healthy as normal, but he will survive, and he's resistant to malaria. So they say, now there is a mutation, which is a good mutation, because it renders him resistant to malaria. But you know what? If that person marries another person that has that same sickle cell gene, 1/4 of their children will die of sickle cell anemia. Now, is that a good mutation? I should say not. The person who has it is not well. He can survive, but he passes that bad gene on to the offspring, and they die of sickle cell anemia. Is that a good mutation? I should say not. It's a bad mutation. Thousands of genetic disease in humans are traces to these mutations. If there's a lot of good mutations, I wish Dr. Pigliucci would just describe one or two. That would be helpful. Mutations are bad, they're harmful, they're certainly not beneficial. Well, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Now he said that eyes, you know, many creatures have eyes, and they evolve many times. You know what the evolutionists say? Yes, eyes did evolve many times independently. Can you imagine an eye, as complex as it is, could evolve once by these random mutations? That's hard enough to imagine. But imagine that it happened many times. That makes it incredibly difficult. And you know what? The vertebrates, the very simplest, most primitive vertebrate on this earth, has the same eyes that you and I have, essentially, the vertebrate eye. There's no sense talking about the origin of the vertebrate eye. They just suddenly appear. Now, about the invertebrates, there are different kind of eyes, but some of the very simplest eyes are found in the most complex invertebrate, and the most complex eyes are found in some of the most simple invertebrates. There's no rhyme or reason to support evolution based upon the origin of eye. Their complexity and purpose and design speaks of intelligent creation. Well, I've assumed I've run out of time, and thank you again.
Okay, a few more things to answer. First of all, where are beneficial mutations described? If Dr. Gish would like to take a look at the December issue of the Journal of Genetics, 1998, for example, you will find a paper modestly published by myself. I'm sorry if I have to quote my own stuff, but I was challenged on it, in which there is a description of several mutations found in my laboratory actually increase fitness quite a bit. This is not an isolated case. I'm not the first one. If I were the first one, I would have gotten the Nobel Prize by now, but unfortunately, that's not going to be in my future. If mutations are not errors, why is there a DNA repair system in organisms? It is true that there is a DNA repair system in many organisms, including the bacterium E. coli that Dr. Gish showed. Well, there is DNA repair mechanisms because too many mutations are not a good thing. Now, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. If you eat too much chocolate, I'm sure you will agree that that's not a good thing either. Therefore, organisms tend to limit the number of mutations. But it's very interesting to find out that that E. coli that Dr. Gish branded as an example of a perfect organism is actually not perfect at all. It is an amazing organism, that's no surprise. It's the result of 4 billion years of evolution. 4 billion bacteria have been around since 4 billion years ago. That's a lot of time. So no wonder you can invent a wheel in 4 billion years. But the question is, it is simply not true, demonstrably not true, that bacteria, all parts in bacteria have to be there for the bacterium to work. You can cause experimentally plenty of mutations, and those mutations are also found under natural conditions in bacteria, which knock out several of the functions of a bacterial cell, and the bacterial cell is doing just fine, thank you very much. Not only that, bacteria, and in particular Escherichia coli, which is the full name of that bacterium, have an interesting system which is called the SOS repair system. They have two ways of repairing their DNA. In one case, they use the same mechanism pretty much that almost every other organism uses, and that's that proof-correcting mechanism that Dr. Gish was talking about. However, if the environment is changing rapidly and the bacteria is under stressful conditions, for example, if the temperature becomes very high or the amount of UV radiation which is damaging to the bacterium increases, what happens is that the bacterium starts using a different system to fix its DNA. That system is called the SOS repair system. The SOS repair system actually causes mutations. Okay? So it doesn't fix things, it makes them worse, according to Dr. Gish. Well, it is demonstrably true, people have done the experiment, that the SOS system is what makes possible for that bacterium to actually survive the stressful environmental conditions. Because some of the many mutations that are caused by the SOS system are actually beneficial, and they will allow the progeny of that bacterium to survive. This can be done every day in the laboratory conditions. It doesn't take anything. Any microbiology lab can do it. It's been published, so it's not something that it's out there. Dr. Gish studied Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, the British astronomer. who's allegedly demonstrated that evolution could not possibly occur by mathematical calculations. Well, I really don't like to attack people on the basis of their accomplishments or lack thereof. I'd like to focus on the actual results. But since there is no time here to get into why Fred Hoyle was wrong, let me tell you this. Dr. Fred Hoyle has the unique distinction of having gotten a medal from the Royal Astronomical Society of Britain for the highest number of theories proposed in a scientific career that turned out to be wrong. That's a fact. Now, was he right on the theory on the probability theory applied to evolution? Of course not. Didn't I tell you that Dr. Gish was going to come up with the tornado in the junkyard argument? That argument is based on a misunderstanding, which is shared by Dr. Fred Hoyle, of what evolution is about. Evolution is not a random process. It is a combination of a random and non-random process. The non-random process is natural selection. I really have a hard time understanding why this is so difficult for creationists to deal with. Once that you have a non-random process in the mix, you can't throw out numbers, probabilities, on the basis of randomness. Because of course on the basis of randomness evolution will not occur, but we're not saying that it is a random process. So it's like trying to poke holes into something else, into a straw man that no evolutionary biologist would actually defend. I think I'll close here for now. Thank you.
Well, we've been going rapid fire here tonight. It looks like we're kind of running out of things to say. We've been going so fast. Now, he said, you see, Fred Hoyle was all wrong, that evolution is not random. And it's not like a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747, as Fred Hoyle used that sort of illustration. The origin of life would have to be a random process, ladies and gentlemen. What does the evolutionists say? Natural selection. What is natural selection? It's differential reproduction. Some organisms reproduce in larger numbers than others. That's all natural selection is. Some things are more fit than others, and therefore they reproduce in larger numbers, therefore they replace the original. That's the theory. May I point out, ladies and gentlemen, before there's living organisms, there's no reproduction. Fred Hoyle was talking about the origin of life. Before there was ever a living thing, before there ever was reproduction. And these molecules are floating around in the water. Supposedly, I can give you 50 reasons very quickly, probably 50, why the evolutionary origin of life is absolutely impossible. It's contradicted by what we know in physics and chemistry. And now this probability, you have these molecules, supposedly amino acids floating around in the water. And they'd have to link up with one another. Now, first of all, they don't do that. Now, secondly, there's no natural selection here. One amino acid, if it could link up with another, would just do it randomly. It wouldn't care what it linked up with. If it could link up, it would just link up. Now, if you give a monkey a typewriter and some paper and let him type away, what does he type? Just nonsense. Doesn't make sense. When you take the letters of the English alphabet and arrange them in a specific way, then you convey information. You conform to the rules of language and you convey information. But monkeys could just do that randomly. Now these amino acids would combine randomly. There's no natural selection at all. The laws of probability would apply. Fred Hoyle is right. The probability of an evolutionary origin of life is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, Fred Hoyle is no ignorant individual. He says what he got for making mistakes. Well, that's what the majority of these astronomers believe. Fred Hoyle doesn't conform in many ways. He is a leading astronomer. Some said he should have received the Nobel Prize. He certainly knows when he talks about probability relationships and mathematics and so forth and so on. No natural selection. You could not overcome these improbabilities. Now, he says there are all kinds of good mutations. My, I wish that people get these. Now, I don't know. Maybe he can give me some references in the literature after this, and I can read that literature, be made aware of these good mutations. I know there's sometimes when evolution alleged that some change occurred by a mutation and it would be beneficial. But there are many other explanations to explain this. And you just have an animal or a plant that undergoes some mutation that makes it stronger or better or more fit. Listen, we have irradiated those little fruit flies for thousands and thousands of generations to speed up the mutation process. We've got a lot of bad flies, but we've never got a better fly. I'd like to close with this statement. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 or 4 centuries ago, the notion that the sun and other planets revolved around the earth was a dogma of the scientific establishment, and Galileo faced determined opposition from fellow astronomers when he suggested otherwise. Louis Pasteur and others, about a century ago, overturned the established dogma of centuries when they showed that living things never arise spontaneously from dead matter. Today, even though thousands of scientists are creationists, and the number is growing rapidly, the notion of evolution is a stifling dogma. Evolutionists seek to smother all challenges from within or without the scientific and educational establishments, concealing the fallacies and weaknesses of the theory and adamantly opposing a hearing for the scientific case for creation. Why is this so? Certainly not because the notion of evolution is science and the concept of creation is religion. I can think of 2 possibilities. First, it may be that evolutionists consider that our students are too ignorant, too illiterate to be exposed to these competing ideas of origin. They must be protected from error and carefully indoctrinated in correct ideas by those who consider themselves to be the intellectual elite, the sole possession of truth. Secondly, having engendered this fragile towers of hypotheses piled on hypotheses, where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion, it may be that evolutionists are aware of the fact that the notion of evolution will fare badly if exposed to an open and determined challenge from creation scientists, and that if this is done, the majority of our students will accept creation as the better of the 2 concepts of origins. Whatever may be the case, it is urgent that our students be exposed to all of the evidence, all of the arguments on each side of this question, so that these 2 alternative concepts of origin, creation and evolution, can compete freely in the marketplace of ideas. Thank you very much.
The moderator will address questions, direct questions to the speakers in alternating order. 2 minutes per answer, 2 minutes per reply, 1 minute for summation, and 1 minute for summation. The first question is addressed to Dr. Pigliucci. You believe we humans most recently evolved from apes. Also, how do you believe the Grand Canyon was formed? Please reply.
The answer to the first question is yes, I believe that humans derived from apes. I don't think that's a belief. There's quite a bit of evidence that's consistent with that theory. So I don't know why that is a question, I guess. I thought I made that pretty clear during the presentation. The second question is, how did the Grand Canyon form? The Grand Canyon formed by a series of processes, the main one of which was sedimentary accumulation of sediments over long periods of time. So all those strata that you can see, all those bands you see of Grand Canyon are sedimentary rocks that accumulated over long periods of time. We can call a geologist and let us more about it. I don't know of any geologist who has a problem with the origin of the Grand Canyon.
Well, if he is not aware of that, he ought to read a little bit of the geological literature. I visited the south rim of the Grand Canyon a number of years ago and visited the museum. They described several theories about how the Grand Canyon formed. They explained its problems with all of them. And then they gave the ideas of the Havasupai Indians. who said the Grand Canyon formed as a result of a great worldwide flood. I believe it's very possible they know much more about it than the geologists do. Certainly no geologist, that is at least one familiar with the geology of the Grand Canyon, believes that the Grand Canyon was cut by the Colorado River. There's 1,000 cubic miles of material was eroded away. It ought to be down there in the delta of the Colorado River. It's not there at all. It's way out to the west, some other place. Evolutionists do not know how it formed. Geologists do not know how it formed. We believe it's very possible that it did result from a great worldwide flood. We have 350 million cubic miles of water on the earth. Mars doesn't have a single drop of liquid water. And yet evolutionists believe that great canyons up there were cut by flooding, massive flooding. They don't have a drop of water up there, and we got 350 million cubic miles here. If there was a massive dam, massive lakes up to the northeast, and there, we know that there have been, we see the fossil lakes, and they're dammed up by debris and so forth, and that debris suddenly gave way, and that huge amount of water came washing down through there when that material was still unconsolidated, cut that Grand Canyon in a very short space of time.
I'm sure that a lot of people here... Microphone. Oh, there you go. I'm sure that a lot of people here have seen the movie with Kevin Costner. I think it was called Waterworld. The reason Waterworld cannot occur is because we actually know how much water there is to go around once that you account not only the oceans, the underwater, the underground water that is available, the water that is in the atmosphere as water vapor, and of course the water that is in the form of ice at the polar caps. When you put all that water together, there's just no way you can have a worldwide flood. There's not enough water. So where did the extra water come from? And more importantly, where did it go?
It's very easy to understand where it goes. The ocean floor today is several thousand feet lower than it was in the past. We know that because there's drowned islands at the bottom of the ocean thousands of feet below the surface. We know that. And if there was a flood of this kind and the ocean floors rose and the continental floors dropped, you could flood the entire earth without a drop of rain. And so that is a very possibility because the ocean floors have subsided since that time and continental floors have risen. So there is certainly a great amount of evidence to support that notion.
Dr. Gish. Dr. Pigliucci gives concrete scientific findings and evidence for his theory of evolution. He has these findings to back the belief that possibly man has evolved. What do you have other than your faith to back that man was put here by a higher being? I don't see that you have any scientific proof on creationism or real evidence.
Well, I'd almost chuckle at that statement. After much time to explain the nature of the fossil record, where these invertebrates, complex invertebrates, suddenly appear. There's no ancestors, there's no transitional forms. There's absolutely no ancestors for the fishes, for the vertebrates. There's no connecting forms. How else would you explain their origin? Dr. Fatuma in another place says this, that either organisms arose from preceding organisms by gradual change, or they appeared suddenly fully formed. If they appeared suddenly fully formed, then they must have been created by an intelligent agent. Well, that is my contention. They did appear fully formed. There's no evidence that these major kinds, and I could go on and on and on, the flying reptiles, the marine reptiles, all appear fully formed. No trace of any ancestors and things like that. That is positive evidence for creation. That's what we must predict, we must expect on the basis of creation. But it is absolutely incompatible with the theory of evolution. You just cannot have hundreds of millions of years producing complex invertebrates, another 100 million years producing the vertebrates, and not leave a trace. That's not possible. Now that's positive evidence. The evidence I gave for design and purpose, isn't that evidence of a creator? The fact that we have purpose, we see it, it's all pervasive throughout the universe and through living things. And I gave you only one example. I could give you many examples of the evidence for purpose and design and integration. it's tremendous evidence for the existence of a creator, of a designer. That's positive evidence. That's data. The data I gave from the fossil record, the data I gave from based on the laws of thermodynamics, the data I gave on the basis of the origin of life, that's all data, and it supports creation.
I think, as I mentioned before during my presentation, this is going to be, the audience should be aware of this. This is really an exercise in critical thinking. If you listen to Dr. Gish by himself without challenge, it sounds pretty reasonable. If you listen to myself without challenge, I think I sound pretty reasonable. The question is, during the challenge, what happens? Well, during the challenge, the devil is in the details. So you have to pay attention to the details, and you might not want to make up your mind necessarily tonight. By the way, the implication of the debate is that somebody wins the debate. Nobody wins debates. The point of debates is to present alternative opinions. Then you go home, you think about it. You eat a sandwich, and then you think about it, then you read a book about it, and you read something else, then you email both of us, and then you keep thinking about it for the rest of your lives, because this is a pretty complex topic. Now, why all this presentation, all this introduction? Notice that Dr. Gish has completely ducked the question. The question was about the origin of humans, for which there is an ample fossil record, and he talks about the evolution of invertebrates. Is that answering the question? No, but it's an important detail.
Well, he claimed I didn't produce any positive evidence, and he mentioned the origin of man. I did discuss that. I did discuss it. I pointed out the Australopithecine, supposed to be one of the most important things in human evolution, the central figure in human evolutionary schemes for many years. The experts in the field, Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Oxnard, who studied these things extensively for years and years and years, said they were not intermediate to an ape and man. They were not human ancestors. Now, what am I doing? I'm showing their evidence is faulty, that they supposedly link apes to man. I'm maintaining that these creatures were apes, and that's all they were. They were not intermediate at all. Now, that's answering the question, definitely.
Dr. Pigliucci, assuming evolution is true, please explain why it stopped and where in the strata. I am assuming it stopped because obviously it no longer occurs as a perceived constant, such as gravity or relativity.
No, evolution never stopped. It's going on under your eyes. That's why I brought up the example of the AIDS virus, for example. There is plenty of evolution is going on. One of the tasks that my students and my postdocs in my lab do is to go out there every day and measure natural selection in the making. For example, we have demonstrated that in the plant in which we work, but the same work has been done in animals as well. Not only there is natural selection, but contrary to what Dr. Gish said a few minutes ago, natural selection doesn't necessarily favor the mean of the population, the most common individual in the population. We've demonstrated plenty of evidence in which cases in which natural selection actually favors extreme individuals within a population, and that's how evolutionary theory predicts the populations change and eventually species change. So I don't know where the notion that evolution stopped came from. It's simply not true.
Well, when someone asked Dr. Theodosius Brzezinski, famous evolutionist, to describe something in the world today that demonstrates evolution, he said he didn't know of any. You'd have to go to the fossil record to find that. There is no place in this earth today where a new organ is coming into being, where a new creature is coming into existence, where something is evolving into another creature. Not one example of that is known. And it has been said, it's in the evolutionary literature, that this is true. He mentioned the AIDS virus. The AIDS virus was detected a number of years ago. What is it today? It's the AIDS virus. That's what it is. It's varied. We have many races of people. We have many varieties of finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos Island. What are those finches? They're finches. They're finches then, they're finches now. And not only are they still birds, they're still finches. And they interbreed and produce fertile offspring. They cite that as a supposed example of evolution. You start with corn and you modify it as still corn. You start with a fruit fly and you do all these experiments and you radiate it and all these mutations. What do you end up with? The fruit fly, and a bad fruit fly, a terrible fruit fly, without wings or stubby wings or something like that. You don't ever get a better fly. There's no real example of one creature changing into a basically different creature, not on this face of this earth, and there should be thousands of them, because evolutionists believe that animals have been on this earth for millions of years, some for 300 million years. The coelacanth fish, been on here for 70 million years, still the same old fish.
I'm glad you brought up the corn. We know the corn originated from another species called Theosinte, and now we know exactly all the details of the genetic details that actually brought up that change. You can reproduce many of those changes under laboratory conditions. You can cause the same mutations in Theosinte, which actually originated corn. So here's one example. I pointed out before that there are several other documented examples of evolution of novel species of invertebrates, of some birds, especially of plants. The reason I say especially plants is because plants are particularly easy to work with, and insects are particularly easy to work with. That's why we have most of our examples there. You have to imagine that if to obtain a new species of vertebrates, for example, a vertebrate typically lives a lot longer than an insect or a bacterium or a plant. Okay, well, some plants live a lot longer. But therefore, it becomes more difficult to actually obtain examples in vertebrates, but they are out there. There are several examples of bird species that have been observed. Now, we have never observed, of course, directly a bacterium transforming itself into a human. That will take quite a lot of time. It actually has taken about 4 billion years. And plus, as my professor of biophysics said, the ideal of a bacterium is not to become a human, it's to become two bacteria, and that's what usually they do.
Well, they worked with, people started with a variety of corn that was not a very good producer many years ago, and they bred and selected to have the modern corn, but it's still the corn. The genes that we find in modern corn was in the original corn, but it's been concentrated in a certain way to produce the modern variety of corn. Another example is the many dogs that we have. All these varieties of dogs, where'd they come from? From the wild dog. Man really selected certain genetic traits and kept breeding and selecting until he produced the 4-pound Chihuahua, the 180-pound Great Dane, the Collie, and everything else. But all of these genetics that we see in the modern dog was in that original dog. No evolution is involved whatsoever. We know the poinsettias, the beautiful poinsettias we have in San Diego. They came from Mexico. Down in Mexico, they're little scrubby plants. Some plant breeder years ago, just there in the San Diego area, took these things and he kept working with these, breeding and selecting and breeding until we have that beautiful poinsettia that we have today. But all of those is still a poinsettia. You see, evolution has to explain how these different kinds of creatures came into existence, how finches and canaries and ducks and eagles and so forth came into existence. That's what you have to explain, not these minor variations you can do by not what we call selection and breeding. That's not evolution at all.
Dr. Gish, please discuss the footprints at a riverbed in Texas. Does a man's footprint cross a dinosaur's footprint, and does this prove the coexistence of man and dinosaur?
This evidence has been studied down there for many years. There was someone who studied those footprints there. There are undoubted dinosaur footprints in the Glen Rose area there, Paluxy River bed. There's no question there's dinosaur footprints. Now, there were prints that looked like human tracks, and those of the dinosaurs. And it was maintained, therefore, that evidence that man and dinosaurs coexisted. Now, that has been studied very carefully. Evolutionists just reject that out of hand, of course, although some did mention this possibility. Scientists have studied that, and there's people who went down there and studied and claimed that what looked like human tracks, now 3 toes began to appear. And these were dinosaur toes. So they said that these things were really not human tracks, they were dinosaur tracks. Now, Dr. John Morris of our institute and others had studied those and believed that these to be genuine human tracks. Now, in the light of this new evidence, Dr. Morris has retracted this suggestion. He believes that they're not human tracks, that they were dinosaur tracks. And so that claim is no longer said or maintained. Nobody carved these things. They're genuine tracks. There's no question about it. The question is, what are they? There's still people there who claim that there are human tracks there. I've never been there. I have some serious doubts about the nature of the evidence that's been produced. So I never use that evidence at a debate like this or in a lecture because of the questionable nature of the evidence. I really don't believe that it's demonstrated that there are human tracks there.
I totally agree. They're not.
Dr. Pigliucci, if you could, sir, please explain your stand on the canopy theory. That, to me, would explain the 99% extinction you claim. It's called the canopy theory.
Whoever asked the question could possibly explain what the canopy theory is?
The canopy theory is the idea that at one time there was much more water vapor in the atmosphere than there is today. If there was a flood, as described in the Bible, it had to have a lot more water vapor than there is now. Because if it rained over the entire surface of the earth today, you'd only get 1 or 2 inches of rain. So there had to be much more water vapor in the atmosphere before then. It's called the canopy theory. And that is just one of the sources of the water that was produced. So that's the idea.
And where is that water?
In the atmosphere.
When and why?
Invisible water vapor.
Invisible water vapor.
Yes.
Water vapor can be quantified in the atmosphere very precisely. We know exactly how much water vapor is in the atmosphere because even though it is invisible, you can actually measure through particular instruments, but water vapor absorbs certain portions of the spectrum of solar light, which we don't perceive, but our instruments do. So we know exactly how much water vapor is there, and that theory does not account for it.
Well, I thought I explained that there had to be much more water vapor then than there is now, because you just can't get more than 1 or 2 inches of rain. Today I said that. Now there had to be much more water vapor in the atmosphere before the present time, or something that, because we find fossils of dinosaurs above the Arctic Circle, in Alaska above the Arctic Circle. We find fossils of dinosaurs in Antarctica. I just read the other day in a scientific journal, they discovered a fossil forest in Antarctica. They said 300 million years old. And they said Antarctica's always been right there where it is now. Now, if that's really true, then obviously conditions on this earth were drastically different in the past. We had a worldwide mild climate. That's the only